And we're off to the races, talking about salt today. I think salt is the best medicine on the planet for fish keeping. I don't think there's another med out there that is accessible by everyone on the planet, as cheap as this, will treat bacterial, fungal, and external parasites. It also can be very dangerous. Before we even start talking about how much salt to use, I need to demonstrate something that is very, very important when it comes to dosing with salt. So this is very coarse salt, rock salt, big grains, right? I don't know what I'm gonna do with all this salt. I'm just gonna put it right here. The way that sits in a spoon when you're measuring it is much different than something like this. So this Fritz salt, also rock salt, but much finer. I gotta show you guys this. It's a very fine grain. So let me put that on the stack over here as well, making a giant mess. So that in a spoon will be different. There'll be a different amount of salt in that spoon. If you were to weigh it and then weigh the rock salt, they'll weigh different amounts. So if you were to follow these directions on this package, and let's say you ran out and you're like, oh sweet, I've got some Aquariumcoop bulk salt, I'm gonna use a tablespoon of that. They're different, it's not the same. If we were very good aquarists, we would run it by salinity, which we'd have to have meters to test the salinity of water. And in freshwater aquariums, we use such low levels of salt typically, a salinity meter doesn't even make sense, and sometimes it can't pick it up. Why does Aquariumcoop carry this? Because it's a fine salt. What I mean by that is it's going to dissolve quickly, and if a fish was to eat it, it wouldn't be eating a big old piece of it. Like, there's a few little benefits to it. So that's basic rock salt. Then you've got other salts like Epsom salt. Now, Epsom salt you might get at a pharmacy. It's a lot of magnesium. Now, we can suspend a lot of chemicals in salts. So like Easy Green has a lot of salts in it. So some of you guys will say like, hey, I've got some crusty stuff on the end of the pump head, right? So this part right here, this pump head right here, it'll get like a little bit of green crust. Well, when you squirt something out, the stuff that's left in the end of the tube, like if you don't get the drops out, it evaporates, right? And if you've ever owned a saltwater tank or seen some of the saltwater tank, it crystallizes and it does what's called salt creep. So basically, as the water evaporates, the salt creeps out. And so it creeps out around the little pump. If you soak that in water, it dissolves back in. It's just crystallized versions of the fertilizer. So Epsom salt, same thing. A lot of magnesium is what is in this salt. It relaxes muscles. That's why if you're taking a bath, you might put Epsom salt in the water. We use it to relax some fish if we're trying to get rid of dropsy or swim bladder issue. Then we've got things like marine salt. Now, marine salt is kind of like you've taken a bunch of minerals and mixed it with NaCl, which is nerd talk for this is just salt. Marine salt does have a lot of trace elements in it, which could be good for plants, could be good for fish, and other things long term. It also has buffers for pH and hardness and that kind of stuff. You can really get your water parameters out of whack. So if you were to use a cup of this versus a cup of marine salt that I don't have, you'd have way different experiences. For the most part, anything that's NaCl, even with like a little bit of iodine in it, is gonna work. But 1 tablespoon per 3 gallons will start fighting off mild bacterial infections, mild fungal infections, and it will irritate slime coat. Why would we want to irritate a slime coat on a fish? Well, if we make it excrete more mucus on the scales, it becomes more resistant to parasites. It can help cover over the bacterial infection to keep it from more bacteria getting in, things like that. So that's at 1 tablespoon per 3 gallons. Now, at 1 tablespoon per 2 gallons, it's slightly better at treating bacterial infections and fungal infections, and it starts really, in my opinion, starting to hammer on things like ick, external parasites like that. At very high levels, this is the medications didn't work, the salt's not working, what do I do now? That is 1 tablespoon of salt per 1 gallon of water. Now, that's a lot of salt for a freshwater aquarium. So that'll pretty much knock out almost anything it can, including velvet. That being said, 1 tablespoon of salt can be very hard on some Amazonian fish, some catfish, some what we call scaleless fish or more sensitive fish. And so that's where we get into a problem when we start talking about salt killed this, salt did that, salt cured this, salt didn't do that, because we're not comparing apples to apples. It might be like, well, salt got rid of ick on my neon tetras, But salt killed my puffer. Now, what I like about it is salt, 1, it never goes bad. 2, it's really cheap. 3, everyone's got access to it. You don't have to like start at a high end. You can start low, right? So you could go, let's do 1 tablespoon per 3 gallons for 5 days and let that sit. How does the mouth infection look now? Oh, it's getting better. Great, just don't do anything. Just keep letting it heal. But if after 4 or 5 days it still looks bad or it's getting worse, let's put some more salt in, right? We're gonna take that level of salt we had, 1 per 3 gallons, and then we're gonna put another tablespoon of salt per 3 gallons. So we'll be at 2 tablespoons per 3 gallons, and then give it 5 days. You might go, oh look, it's totally taken care of it. Now, you know, don't put any more salt in, and you'll naturally water change it out. So I do believe that salt is the best possible medication that we have on the market. And yes, it's not a medication. Why doesn't Cory always use it and recommend it? Because it's very hard to dose with thousands of different types of fish, and it only works really well if you don't have live plants. Now, my business is set up on selling you live plants and doing planted community tanks. That being said, if I didn't do that, this is the #1 thing in your arsenal. Like when I ran a African cichlid store, salt, very, very important. African cichlids can tolerate a lot of salt. If you really look into African cichlids, they basically came from salt water millions of years ago and have evolved. Like the bottom crust of the lakes of Lake Malawi is coral, right? You start dosing salt with African cichlids in a store, and all of a sudden you're not getting bacterial infections when they beat each other up. You're not getting fungal infections. You're not getting ick. You're not getting all these things. And so then you go like, well, if I just keep salt in there all the time, then they don't get any of these things. Well, the problem is when you eventually do get something, so let's say you keep a tablespoon of salt per 5 gallons all the time, right? Eventually ick will outbreak, or you'll get a bacterial infection, or you'll get that fungus going on. Now you're gonna have to use a lot more salt to beat that, right? And it's not that we built up a resistance to it, it's that what finally got past your salt barrier basically is now pretty strong. And when we start using more salt, it's harder on fish naturally. And what you start seeing is like, well, maybe the Africans can tolerate it, but what about the other fish? Like, oh, you had a pleco in there. What about, oh, you had a shark in there. And that fish is now a host to get everything sick, right? So it's kind of this domino effect. But used sparingly when needed, salt, very potent, very effective. So what happens is when you add salt to water, it actually does something crazy, and that is it dehydrates fish. Which seems insane because you're literally talking about this thing lives in water, and by adding salt, it will pull water out. But that's what it does. It pulls more water out of the fish. It also does that to everything else. Plants, parasites, snails, all these things it does that to, right? A fish, even if it's a 2-inch tetra, has way more water in it than a tiny little 10 micron cyst of ick. When we're pulling out the moisture from these things in our aquarium, the fish is going to take a lot longer to get that water out than this little parasite. That's how we kill ick. We actually dehydrate ick in water. I have not done enough research to know how does salt specifically kill bacteria and fungus. I would wager it's the same way, but there is someone that knows way more than I do that is totally shaking their head right now going, no, it doesn't work the same way. This guy's a moron. I get it. I haven't done the research. I only did the research on ick. Now, in a perfect world, if everyone had a quarantine tank and a thing of salt on their hands, I believe 60% of all illness you'd ever run into would be quashed by salt. Like bring your fish home, a little bit of salt, 1 tablespoon per 3 gallons, or whatever mix you find to work for your quarantine in your area and your water. Run that for a couple of weeks. I bet you would see very minimal disease outbreak from that point on.
We hope you enjoyed this video. We actually picked another one that we thought you might like, so click on it right here.